hey, whoa, hey. Ah, yeah. Whoa, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, ah, yeah. Whoa, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey. Ah, whoa, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, whoa, hey, yeah. Ooh, see ya. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being here and allowing me to share with you this awesome day.
Oh, thank you so much for that. What a beautiful song. And welcome to everyone. I understand we had a bit of a computer glitch in terms of we thought we were live streaming and we weren't, but that's life in the time of COVID. While we're, as an entertainer, I'm used to just I step to the mark and bark and I hope the check doesn't bounce. Now I have to be lighting, sound, makeup, hair. I never know what's happening technologically, but what was lovely is that the stream did start just as Willie started that song. So I know you all got to hear that beautiful song. So thank you so much for that, Willie, and thank you for being with us today. Now I am going to turn the floor over to Chief Bobby Joe, who is going to give us an opening prayer. And now we usually have to give him just a second to put his camera on. So let's hope he does that.
Yes, it's on.
Excellent.
Greetings, all my relatives. I'm so happy that you are with us today. I feel a heaviness in my own heart, and I know that across this country, there are so many emotions raging between love and peace and anguish, anger, just so many. And I understand that. I understand that when we hear about beautiful little children who were placed in unmarked graves, how that can affect us all, because we love no one more than our little children, the center of our universe. So I'm glad we're here today together for the next little while, because we need each other, that's for sure. All across this land, I hope the message gets around that we can work through some of these most difficult and horrendous situations presented to us. What else could I say? Other than for us to turn to the Creator. I'm so moved that many people across Turtle Island and even around the world have their attention on this moment in Canada for Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. So I'm going to say a prayer in Kwakwala. Even though I spent 11 years in a residential school, I didn't lose my language. I didn't speak it for a very long time too. But when I pray, it makes the most sense for me to pray in my own language. And the things that flow from my heart in so doing are unique to my history, my culture, and everything about Indigenous people. Tela kesla yuli kirema yuli kwile nukuno. Kapana kwirem galis lofkota nala wala squint agano nitnoche, but the kilagano nala. Isquarol imida guasta, quasaceda sesame, sesame, wala sigano saculanus. Misindak elus yuhi quila onukul, casamos cacabala hida, let net na quite hida, ginganan canalte. What Mr. Ek Hila Soklok Walachinu no Hayasuda Net na Wamlachida Sassam to his Kaakam to his Naquatiki Sola. Dak Elus has a kilo Saka no Pacomina Lachulis. Cannot Iganakulame. Look, Igi the Machina Quesha as to it the Asam Kacha. Wala sida iahinetli. Mr. Notak Elus has almost casa to no. A hema was that tree, wachatli, watem, all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Chief Bobby Joe, always setting us on the right path as we start these sessions. For those of you who couldn't hear us at the very beginning, this is the third in a session that's going to run over 8 weeks, every Saturday and every Tuesday evening. And the focus of today's session is about anger and grief. And if you think about when you go to the hospital, you go to the ER room, that's because you are in need of critical care. And I believe right now across the country, our communities are in need of critical care. We are suffering under an extreme amount of rage, of grief, of confusion. I'm thinking of myself on the night of Canada Day. Last week I was on The Social and they asked me, do you think we should cancel Canada Day? And trying to be open-hearted and filled with love, I said, no, let's not cancel it. Let's make it a time of observation. Let's make it a time when people really think about what is happening in the Indigenous community. And on the night of Canada Day, as I lay here in my bed in the GTA, the central part of Toronto, I live in Midtown on the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit, fireworks started going off outside my window. They started at about 11:30 and they ended at around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I went from feeling sad to feeling so angry. They had never in the 6 years I've lived here gone on that long. And I almost felt like it was a purposeful thing, like it was somebody pushing back at us, gently trying to say, you know, please acknowledge and please take this time. But then before I let my anger take over, I thought about all of our children, the children who are being unearthed, the children who never made it home, the children who did make it home but damaged, and the children that we have yet to bring home. And that brought my heart back to a place of love and of trying to reconcile and trying to make peace in this situation. So with that in our hearts and that in our minds, I want to take a full minute right now to acknowledge and reflect on all of those children. So I'm going to darken out my screen and I will time a full minute. Please put your mind with the children. Thank you for that moment. I am about to turn the floor over to Karen Joseph. Before I do, I just want to let you know that we're going to have a wonderful panel discussion this afternoon. And just so you know who will be joining us for the panel, it will be Dr. Robert Joseph, Chief Dr. Robert Joseph, who you heard doing the opening prayer, who is the ambassador for Reconciliation Canada. Karen Joseph, who you're about to hear from, will also be on the panel. She's one of the co-founders of Reconciliation Canada, and also somebody I really want to interview at some point. Just putting that little thought in your mind there, Karen. We also have Yvonne Rigsby Jones, who's an addiction specialist for the Health Authority. Jessica Bolduc, who is the executive director of the 4Rs Youth Movement. And Jeremy Jones, who's a health support worker and also an LGBTQ2+ liaison for the Indian Residential School Survivor Society. So that is going to happen momentarily. But before then, we're going to have a few words from our fearless leader, Karen Joseph.
Thank you for that, Candy. I'll take you up on that interview request. That would be a lot of fun, I think, and also informative. But thank you for being here with us today. Thank you for joining us in this important conversation. Candy, it's strange that you should mention that. I too was struggling when Canada Day came. I kind of live in the middle of the city, and I didn't really want to open my blinds because I didn't want to have to necessarily be faced with seeing a bunch of Canada Day flags and things like that. And when I did finally open up the curtains, I actually was relieved because I didn't see that. And so I went and I looked on the website of the city that I live in, and they specifically had on there, they had made all of the lights in the city offices orange. And they had said that they wanted to take this time on this day to reflect on the history of Canada and specifically on the children that we're referring to today. And so that really helped. And yeah, we really wanted to have this conversation because as we're going about doing all of these series, and kind of what first comes up for people really is that rage, and thinking about all of the emotions that go through you. So this is one of those things that happens when you're having an at-home Zoom meeting. I have a little one here with me today, but that somebody will be picking him up very shortly. So I'm gonna leave it at that. I have more to say about it. I think the other thing that was really prevalent to me in the light of all of this that was also as concerning had to do with the spiritual crisis that's happening across the country with people that are questioning their faith as a result of the role of the churches in the unmarked graves of these children and the locations of them. And I think that, that's also very, very concerning in addition to the anger and to the rage. Not that there's anything wrong with anger. I think that's part of what we're going to be talking today is how do we move through that and how do we make sure that that energy is directed in a way that's going to be positive rather than a way that's going to put us or others at risk. And for me, that's the number one issue for us having this conversation today is to figure out how do we move people through all of the challenges that finding these young children's remains has caused to us, myself included. I mean, I adore children, and to think about some of the things that have happened and knowing what I know from being involved with the Survivor Society and with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission all of that, and have being present for so many survivor stories. You know, I think that these are important conversations. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today.
I can't think of anything that would be more appropriate than to hear that voice at the opening of this session. It is almost like somehow the universe has come in and interceded to make sure that it reminded us of why we're here. And that little voice, that's why we're here. So I'm so happy that that turned out that way. Thank you so much, Karen. And I see in the comments, everybody was just so feeling how wonderful it was that all of a sudden we could hear this little voice. And before we went live, Willie, who did our opening song for us, has his little ones with him today, and he had his little infant son in his arms, and it drives it all back home and makes us all really think about what's important. So I'd like to ask all the panelists who I've just named and introduced to, oh, look at that face. Now we can see the face. Any of you who still can see Karen on your screen, look at this. Now I would just have to hug him. I would not get any work done. I'd be hugging and kissing constantly. I'd like all the panelists to turn their screens on and to unmute themselves. And we are going to start this discussion. And I want the viewers to know there will be an opportunity, a 20-minute opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. So just keep putting your questions as they come up through the session in the chat. And Isaac, who's behind the scenes right now, will be gathering those questions together and will give them to me at the end, and we'll address as many of them as we possibly can. But we talked, as Karen was speaking, she talked about a spiritual crisis. So the first kind of question that I would like to lay out to the panel and have you all reflect on, I was raised Catholic. I come from Mi'kma'ki, Ilribar First Nation is my home nation. It is a strongly Catholic community. All of the Mi'kmaq Nation is strongly Catholic. And this week, of course, the head bishop of the Catholic Church made an announcement that he felt that the church is being persecuted. And that, of course, it just enraged me that at this time, that's what he could be reflecting on, that his church feels persecuted. But also, as I was feeling rage, I was remembering my elders, including Sister Dorothy Moore, who's a Roman Catholic nun. And I'm wondering how the people who continue to practice the faith, how they are handling and managing what is happening right now. And I'm talking about the Catholics specific because that church has refused to apologize. The Pope has refused to apologize, where other churches like the United and the Anglican have apologized and have taken their steps toward reconciliation. So I'd like to open that up to the panel. And just have you reflect for me on how you're feeling around that. So you can just jump in as you feel.
I'm gonna jump in, I guess.
Perfect.
Yeah. I'm thinking about where all of my own personal anger began and where I actually learned it from. And my mind goes flying back all the way to the time when I was first admitted into St. Michael's Indian Residential School way back. I was 6 years old, turning 7. And all of a sudden, I found myself in this really brutal environment. All of the staff persons who were supposed to be the caregivers were angry people. They shouted at you all the time, screamed at you all the time, hit you by every means all the time, denigrated your self all the time. And when I'm looking back at those first 2 years, when it's such a critical time in a little child's life to feel belonging and to feel love and to feel cared for, it was exactly the opposite. So So the first emotional impulse I ever had was of adjusting to and trying to accommodate this torrent of abuse by every form. And as I grew older, of course, my learning, what I learned from those experiences was to be resentful at those who had been exhibiting those attitudes and actions toward me. And I, in turn, became angry. And yet, my deeper roots, the previous 5 years before that, were really based on some really significant foundational pieces of love and belonging and being cared for, being part of family, being part of the entire village. And in the ensuing years, it just compounded. And by the time that I had left, I was so confused, and I didn't know it was trauma. I had no idea what trauma meant then. It was a long, long time before I began to understand. And that trauma was fueled by my anger in turn, even though I wasn't in the same environment anymore. I moved on, I carried forth all of these terrible ways of being angry, of being hurtful in every which way. And then when I couldn't understand it, when it was confusing, I began to act out in my own ways, angry, violent, prone to addiction, not caring about myself, not respecting myself, which means you can't hardly respect anyone else. And the whole effect cannonball. And soon my entire life was engulfed in this vacuum of, I don't know if there's one word to describe the entire experience I had and what I lived out after that. And that I'm still from time to time trying to come to grips with. I went to work for the Indian Residential School Survivor Society for a few years. And I know that when survivors were beginning to go to the courts, to the criminal courts and to class action and to healing, we were all cycling in this desire for something bigger, better, purer. And one day I heard the word trauma, and then I began to hear it more and more. And it was then that I realized that survivors were in a turning point. They now could identify what it was that has driven to us to what we had become. And then they said to us, claim it and own it. And then I realized that if we did that, then we might be able to be responsible enough to do something about it, claiming and owning it, and working it through best we could. And then I realized how deep this trauma was. It wasn't just me, it wasn't just my family. There were entire indigenous nations everywhere going through these mental contortion, trying to figure out what the heck is it? Am I subhuman? Am I worth less than others? What is it? And then we slowly began, the light slowly began to shine through. I think this is a really, really important topic today. And I want my friends, the other panelists, they know really, they have life experience behind them, and they can tell you things that we all should know about and understand. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Chief Bobby Joe. Maybe I could have you all reflect on the importance of making space for anger right now. Maybe if we could start with you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Candy. I think that's a good question. I think for so many years, people were taught to not show their anger. And also, if you're a survivor, the consequence of showing your anger sometimes was so harsh and so out of control that it's scary sometimes. But the other side of that, and Jeremy's my son, that he had when he was very young, came up with the term that letting your anger go is like when you shake up a Coke bottle and take the lid off. And for a lot of survivors and their children, that's what anger looked like, the explosion, because it would simmer and simmer and simmer. And then when it couldn't be held anymore, it would go everywhere. And it was so harsh and so unpleasant that until people can find the opportunity, and until the early 90s, the opportunities, as Bobby was saying, of really having places to identify and really heal that old trauma, to help with that anger, which is underneath all the grief. I mean, it's really complex. The ability to really, really do that deep healing wasn't available to a lot of people. And so there's been a lot of harm created in our communities, and it's all linked together. And so people often got labeled as bad or harsh. And there's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about anger. And there's not a lot of ability to be allowed to show it. And then people would try to stuff it, which didn't work, because then it would be the Coke bottle explosion. And so I'm really grateful. Thank you to Karen for having these discussions right now. And I encourage people, if you're going through grief of any kind or anger, to find some ways of learning to address it. Not everybody explodes. We all take different avenues of dealing with it. Some people make themselves physically ill. We all look after our own anger in different ways. Some people have figured out healthy ways of dealing with it. But anger is basically, it's really okay to be mad. That, I think, is the biggest message. It's really okay to be angry. And for people who have experienced unconscionable behaviors toward them, you have every right to be mad. That's the other piece. You have every right to be angry. And the message here is, if you're mad, find a way, find some help.
Thank you for giving people that permission, because I think that's often not there. Maybe as we move to Jess, as women, from the time we're little, they tell us that little girls are made of sugar and spice and everything nice, and that you're supposed to be a lover, not a fighter, and all those things that are meant to keep us small and keep us quiet. As you reflect, I wonder if you could take that into consideration as you talk about the importance of anger.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that I want to share is something that I heard from a trauma expert in the States, Resma Manikin, who said that rage is aged anger. And anger is grief. And another way to think about that is that anger is maybe the bottom side or the other side of love. And so it's through all of that love that grief and that anger shows up, or the loss of that love. And what Yvonne was saying about giving permission to be angry, I think is really, really critical for not only our communities. So I'm an Anishinaabe from Bawatin Bachuana First Nation. So I just want to acknowledge my people and where I'm calling in from. But for my community, but also for non-Indigenous folks to be able to sit in the discomfort of our rage. Because I think it's easy for us to comfort someone who is hurting and is expressing through tears. But it's a whole lot harder. I've witnessed this even for myself, to meet someone in their rage, because that person's actually looking for something. They're looking for comfort too. But yet then we turn against them or villainize them in our communities, and continue to push them away, when what folks are really asking for is to be invited into a healing process or to be heard. And I think about, I think about the ways that, Indigenous women in particular are leading a lot of the movements and the frontline movements that are happening right now, whether that's land and water protection, or some of the other things that are happening within our communities, and how they are being presented as criminals. And that how their voices and standing up for the things in our communities are then turned into something negative. And so to me, it's for us to be able to see the ways in which that we need to have a different relationship with anger to be able to move reconciliation forward. And I think that it's ironic that the churches find themselves being persecuted, especially considering that the Truth and Reconciliation process in Canada was one that I believe was led in the spirit of restorative justice. And so, like, unlike, say, for example, the Reconciliation Commission that happened in South Africa, where people were actually held to the criminal courts for what they did, that was missing in part of this. So it seems funny to me that there would be this sort of playing a victim that's happening right now. And to, like, faith communities, I think what a better time than now to be able to step into your values as faith communities. And to show up and to even go down to some of the monuments or even some of the churches that have art installations, which is what Indigenous people are seeing these as, to go and listen and talk to the people and to be with them in their anger and rage, because that's about us healing together and creating understanding together instead of distancing ourselves from things that might feel fearful for us. So I think that that's probably all I'll say about that. But thanks for hitting us with the hard questions right off the bat, Candy.
Well, I like to get in and get at it because we only have limited time. But I love what you raised, because I'm a big fan of the philosopher Rilke, and a quote that he said, where he said, "Let me squander not my hour of despair," because he felt that there is a lot to be learned from our despair and our rage and our anger and our pain. And I think that's important to keep in mind right now. And Jeremy, you and I have the intersectionality of being both Indigenous and queer, and that adds a whole new level to the anger as well. I'm wearing my Love is Love shirt today, even though we're a few days past Pride Month. I'm wondering if you can just talk a bit about your teachings or your personal ability to cope and how you cope with anger. I've seen in the comments a lot of people want to know, like, how we deal with that anger. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Awesome. Hi, Chica. Antimpak Siltsilam, Tanithnak Snotnawis, EIRSSS. My traditional name is Siltsilam. I come from Nanu's First Nations. Yeah, that's a big question. And I think when we pull in all of our identity, because I'm not just Indigenous and I'm not just queer, those are who I am, and they're not, I can't separate them. And I think one of the things when I look at anger and rage and the things that I get frustrated with, especially in these conversations, is who isn't being invited to the table and whose voices aren't being heard. And that's our Two-Spirit, that's our Indigenous queer, that's our trans friends and relatives who, have different struggles that we face and have different rages that we need to deal with. And I think about, oh, okay, cool. So, we have these rages and we have these angers. And I think about how my father talks and how my father was taught from our people, and about how, he talks about rage and anger, and that's a part of a human experience, and it's not the fun part of human experience. It's not the part that we strive for, but it's a part of how we navigate this world. And he says, we did feel it, we did honor it, and we did have ceremony around it. And ceremony is very vital when it comes to dealing with all of our emotions. And ceremony can have a lot of showmanship and have a lot of really beautiful aspects, but sometimes a ceremony is just a breath, because when we breathe out, what are we doing? We're letting go of what is not serving us anymore. And when we breathe in, that's the medicine that was given to us from the plant world, from the plant beings. And that sometimes we lean into these ceremonies and that have all of that showmanship, and sometimes it's just a very simple, we honor our feelings, and then we also say, well, let Matthew be cautious if you're feeling sorrow and grief and rage, that you be really cautious on how you walk and how you talk, because of that power that these feelings come up can make our words sharp. It can make our actions sharp. And so we feel it and we honor it, but we try to be really cautious. And I'll be the first one to say that it's a lot easier said than done. That it's like very like easy in this moment where I have a lot of comments be like, just breathe, but definitely in a rage, all of these emotions come up. So yeah, it's finding those tools that we carry, because each of us has gifts and each of us has things that work for us, and each of us has been taught things that don't work for us. And it's important to honor all of that, to know that not every ceremony is going to fit for everybody, and not every therapeutic tool is going to fit for everybody, but we do need to lean into those tools and find those things that help us in rage and anger, and to have the permission to feel it, but also have the tools to move in it in a good way. So that's my 2 cents on that. Thank you.
I love, Jeremy, that the moment you said about a breath, ceremony can be a breath. I noticed that all of us, who you can see visually, we all took a breath and we all released it. So thank you for kind of centering us in that breath. And I love that you talk about the sharpness of words. In the first 2 sessions, I talk a lot about self-love. And one of the most important things about self-love is to check the words that you use in your own mind about yourself. Maya Angelou said, words are real. They get on your clothes and in your hair, and eventually they get inside you. And it's a daily process to constantly check, am I using negative thoughts and words about myself? Because you just can't get to that self-love place if that's something that's happening. Now, if I look at the movements in the civil rights, you had Martin Luther King and you had Malcolm X. They both wanted the same thing, but Malcolm X was saying by any means necessary until the end of his life. And Martin Luther King was saying peaceful. So on Canada Day, we had a lot of peaceful demonstrations all across the country. I was happy to see that on Yonge Street, right close to where I live in Toronto, all the store windows, their mannequins were dressed in orange. Everything from Lululemon to little independent stores all had orange in their windows. But we also saw some trophies or some statues being toppled. And I wonder, Karen, as you take the microphone again, if you could reflect a bit on where that fits, where those acts of vandalism fit in the overall expression of anger, and how we deal with that as we try to move forward on our road to reconciliation.
Pressed the wrong one, but Well, I think that it makes, on the one hand, it makes so much sense in that there's this helplessness as all of this is coming up. And I really appreciated what Jess said about, anger really being an expression of grief, which is related to love. And when you're in a situation where that these are our children and that they've been treated in this way and that they've been so utterly disrespected and so utterly harmed, like in ways that it's unimaginable. And yet we know, right? So for somebody outside of our cultures, it's unimaginable, but for us, we know. And when that rage comes up because you feel it, all you have to do is think about if somebody ever hurt your own kids, what would you do? and then somebody expresses it this way, it's understandable in its own sense. And I think that, which is why we need some of these, why we've been calling this a crisis, a critical moment in Canada's history, because those are very valid responses to what's going on here. They're human responses when we're talking about those things. And yet we have nothing in place to provide that support, which is why we started these kind of conversations, was to try to have an opportunity for people to be heard, to try to reflect some of the things that we're hearing in all of this. And so on that sense, it's there. But the reality is that the people that are going to get hurt from that are us. You know, we've seen this play out in our history before. It's going to be our younger people mostly that are going to get hurt, because the response is generally swift. This response is generally extreme, and is directed from a sense of justifiable anger on behalf of, police and the army and all of those kinds of things. That's how they're trained to respond, and it's justifiable given the rage, but somehow the rage that's being expressed isn't. And so when the first crime has been perpetrated and nothing's been done about it, and everybody knows. And so where do you sit in all of that? And like everybody says, it's we have to find a way through it. We have to, because I truly believe that rage will eat you up inside. It will kill you in a way. It'll kill the love that people have for you, that you're able to express for other people. And that disconnects us even more from what we need to be the kind of people that we want to be. And I think one of the things that somebody mentioned, I think it was Jess again, is to be heard, and to be listened to, because that's what's happening here. People aren't being heard. This is horrific, and no response is coming. It's starting now, but it took some time, and it took too long, because and it didn't happen out of, it didn't happen in the way that one would think if you actually cared about your fellow human beings, And I think it reiterates the sense that we have as Indigenous people, that our experiences, because they're always so horrific, are now, people are rather indifferent to it, and don't realize that, when you look at our, I talked about this before, you look at our children and how much death that they've experienced by the time they're 5 or 6 years old, and I know little kids that have experienced harsher things than most grown adults would experience by the time they're in school. And the other thing that I've really appreciated, because I've been looking at this for a long period of time, is looking at that sort of neural response that we have in it, the neurophysiology of it, of anger, of rage. And knowing that if you grow up in an environment that those are the sort of neural tracks that are laid down, that's the way you respond. It's like a reaction, right? Something happens and that's your reaction. And it's like a deeply worn groove that is sort of, that is just kind of a reaction, just like I said. And what it takes to move out of that worn pathway. I was talking to this about my daughter one day, because I was really struggling to figure it out. And I said to her, it's kind of like, if you think about some people as kind of going 4-wheel driving, and they've been doing it for so long that they built this really big rut where their two tires are stuck in there. And there are certain places in life where you really just can't veer off of that track because the vehicle is not capable of even doing that. I said, that's kind of like people that are older and that have been behaving that way for a really long time. They can change, but it takes a lot of effort and a lot of concentration. And I said, and if you're younger and you haven't experienced that in the same way, I said, you're more like an ATV. You can kind of go anywhere. You make your own tracks. You can do whatever you want to do. And you can respond really, really differently. And so I think, you know, what do we do about those things? You have to make a conscious decision to think that way. What you said, Candy, was so important in terms of rebuilding those tracks. You know, we cannot love anybody any differently than we love ourselves in the way that we express it, right?
I,
Talking about his turtle in his bucket.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah.
I love that you talked about how long it took for the response as well, because I'm a news junkie, and anytime something happens, like somebody in uniform is in any way threatened or attacked, boy, the flag at the Parliament building comes to half mast in a heartbeat. And after that discovery, the first discovery was made all weekend, I kept waiting to see that Canadian flag lower at Parliament, and it didn't. It didn't until quite late in the day on Monday. And it's like you say, that should have been somebody's instinct to say, oh my goodness, this has happened. Let's get that flag down. But no, it had to come from pressure from the community. And I had someone ask me when all this first started, you know, it's too bad they couldn't build monuments where those residential schools were so that people could learn. And it made me think of Isabel Knockwood, who's a Mi'kmaq elder who just passed during COVID, but she wrote an incredible book called Out of the Depths about her time at the Shubenacadie Residential School. And what she chose for her cover art was a picture of that residential school on fire, because one night, mysteriously, that school caught fire when it was sitting there abandoned. And a lot of survivors came to watch it burn. And I wonder, Chief Bobby, if you could talk a little bit about that feeling of yes, we want to teach, but how healing is it to watch it burn?
Yeah, and those are contradicting images for sure, but they're real. And that's the first step. We have to acknowledge that anger and hate, and on the other end of the spectrum, peace and love. As solitudes, they exist right now in our country. And in the middle, there are a whole lot of people seeking resolution to this situation that we're in. And I think that the only way we're going to get past this moment in history as well is when we truly learn to see each other, hear each other, talk to each other, respect each other, have dialogue that really shifts our understanding of each other. Because if we never understand each other, we're never going to have the same value attached to human life ever. It's just not possible. So we as a country, if we want to live up truly to our aspirations as being a really good country, we got to have this dialogue. This reconciliation's got to get real, and people from all walks of life have to commit themselves to it and get involved. That's why we so often say in talking to Canadians, reconciliation should be and always should be a core value. We live it, breathe it. When we go to bed at night, we hang it up right at the head of our bed, and we pick it up in the morning, and we begin the same practice, seeing the same things, doing the same things, promoting peace, love, harmony, equality, justice, all of those things. It's really a conundrum that we're in this country right now, from all walks of life. all colors, all creeds. We're all at different little places about what we think reconciliation should be or ought to be. And so it's time now for us to begin to start the real trek towards reconciliation.
You know, I think as I watched the news and I watched people react to the toppling of those statues, and I saw how organized the fight was in Nova Scotia against removing Cornwallis's statue, I couldn't help but reflect that if non-Indigenous people could be as protective and as angry about dead children as they are about statues, wow, we'd be much, much further down this line, because we're expected to understand that anger around a statue where they can't make space for the anger around dead children, which is, you know, such a disconnect. I am going to turn over now to questions from the audience, and there have been some wonderful questions coming in, and also some words of encouragement. People just wanting us all to know that they're here to bear witness and that they're hearing us, which we really appreciate from our non-Indigenous neighbors. And I see here there's a question, and I love that this person is using the term newcomer. We talked in our last session about why I personally can't stand the word settler, because settler is defined by somebody who comes to a land that is unpopulated with no culture and no structures, social structures. And of course, we had culture and social structures. So this person is asking, I've learned so much from sitting around the fire and listening to survivors share their anger and traumatic stories. Are there other culturally sensitive ways that newcomers can come alongside survivors and their families to journey with them to help the trauma, the anger, and the grief? And anyone who'd like to address that?
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind to me is that our communities are often so open. And our circles are big. And so there are often, I mean, COVID creates a different kind of situation in how we gather as communities, but things like this, to me, this is community and this is us gathering in circle. But, you know, showing up when there are events being held, and especially showing up when there are protests or actions happening. Because I find that that's a place where folks aren't sure of their role in their space. But the thing I think about, you know, what happened in Digby with the moderate livelihood, we needed, I say we more broadly because I'm in Anishinaabe, but there needed to be folks witnessing that, because without the eyes of the public there on the ground, we know that law doesn't favor Indigenous folks. And so those kinds of things in some of those cases, like thinking about the RCMP showing up and how they sort of were, who they were there for and whose protection they were there for. But I also feel like there's something in learning our own histories of colonization to be able to recognize the ways in which that, you know, the healing that you may be doing in your own community or in your own family actually can have connections to how Indigenous folks themselves, our stories and the impacts that we experience as being people who have been impacted by colonization. And so I think that like the layering and the understanding of our distinct histories, but the ways in which that we can work together in solidarity and collaboration is something that's work for everyone. And the healing work is work for everyone too, regardless of who you are. So I think that that's something that I would share about that.
You know, I think there's a lot to be said for what happens in your home as well. I worked in the education system in Nova Scotia for 10 years as the director of Mi'kmaq education. And anytime I was in schools where there had particularly been Indigenous, non-Indigenous fighting, like really extreme fighting, and I've gone in and spent a day at the school and I spent time with those non-Indigenous kids and tried to get to the bottom of where their thinking stemmed from, every single one of them, without exception, heard it at home. Like they said, when I came to this school, my father told me, just because you're at school, don't think you're going to be inviting any of those Indians to your birthday party, or that you're going to be going up to that reserve. That's not happening. And all that negativity, every time the news is on and you think your kids aren't listening, and you hear something that, which by the way is reported very skewed unless you're watching APTN, then you hear it from our perspective, and you say, oh my goodness, more of our tax money going to those natives. Your kids hear that, and that translates to the schoolyard. So I think what you do in the home as well is just so important. Now, there's a very interesting question here that Jen has asked, where she wants to know from all of you, what are some of the ways that you've used to begin to process your anger in more healthy or positive ways? Who wants to take a jump at that? As you're thinking, I'll just say, for me, writing is really a big way. I write every morning in a journal. I was writing when those fireworks were going off. And I don't mean writing like I'm writing a book right now. I don't mean that kind of writing. I mean the kind of writing that's just for me, that's that I can like just rage it out on the pages of my journal, and I can almost feel it melting out of me as I'm doing it. But maybe Yvonne, you could talk about how you deal with your anger a bit.
Oh, sure. Clean the kitchen because it doesn't hurt anybody. But I can share. I always have John's permission to share. He's my husband, and he's a survivor of terrible abuse at Alberni. And the day after the news, he went to 3 different beaches, and he walked in 3 different bodies of water. And when he sat at Snetnawas, where he's from, on the breakwater, an eagle came and sat beside him. Because he said he had to dump his rage, so he didn't dump it on us. But that's what his dad taught him to do. And so one of his traditional ways of letting his rage go, and also because he had to do something. He had to do something. And he came back to us in a better space because it was so hard. And I just, you didn't ask me this, but I'm just going to share. I love survivors. You're all miracles. You're all miracles. And I'll just add that. And I just remembered the last time I was so angry. I was dealing with a racist paramedic. And after John was taken away in the ambulance, that's what I did. I cleaned the kitchen because I had to deal with the energy, because anger has a lot of energy, and that's what we have to have leave our body. And that was a really good way of having the energy leave my body. But I was aware that it was roaring through my body, all that adrenaline. And I think the more we know ourselves and the more healing we do, the more aware we are of what's actually happening in our bodies. So, like I say, nobody gets hurt if you're cleaning the kitchen.
Thank you for sharing that. I loved hearing that about going to the water. My father was, he was an alcoholic from the time he was young, but he found sobriety in his 30s. And when he died, he was 51 years sober. But he had a lot of unresolved trauma from his childhood. And my dad tended to get around a bit. So he would disappear at night. And once I got a license, I thought, oh, he's chasing women. I'm going to follow him and catch him in the act. And 9 times out of 10, when I followed my father, I would find him driving to the beach, where he would sit in his vehicle for hours alone and look at the ocean. And I would be sitting in my car off in the distance where he couldn't see me, wondering what was happening inside the cab of that truck, in his heart and his soul. But he would sit there for hours and then he would drive back home. And so a lot of times when he left late at night, it wasn't that he was looking for women. He was sitting on the ocean, obviously trying to figure out a way to deal with all that unresolved stuff. It's a complicated road. I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to talk, because I think that was such a good question about how you deal with your own anger, how you work through it in a healthy way.
Mhm.
I'm gonna jump in where it started for me. I left St. Michael's School a pretty broken man. I had no sense of value or purpose. I loathed myself, and I could see no future at all. And I pretty soon sank into alcoholism, and it became a really dark place. But somehow, in that experience of my alcoholism, it led me to a vision, an epiphany. I'm not going to tell epiphany today, but what it said was this: in that epiphany, in that vision, I heard the Creator say to me, I love you, and you're a part of all of this. Part of the epiphany was seeing the whole universe. I love you, and you're a part of all of this, in spite of what you've done to yourself. So I came out of that on the other side and realized that I could no longer be who I had become because of my experience. And there were a lot of things that we can do. I learned to become prayerful. I rejoined my own culture, was involved in ceremonies in it. And I began to reach out for help. Help is everywhere if we're genuinely seeking help. It could be psychiatrists or other experts, counselors of any kind, just talking to somebody else who has a perspective bigger and higher than the one you held while you were in your stage of suffering and loss. And reaching out now in this time of reconciliation. You must know somebody, reach out, try to reach out. Go to a powwow, go to a potlatch, maybe make a phone call, maybe meet the Indigenous parents in the schools where their kids go. There are so many things that all of us can do. And every little step is part of the weaving together that brings all of us together and our lives to a better place.
Mm. And Karen, do you have something to say on this as well?
Yeah, there's a bunch of thoughts going through my mind right now. And, I think part of...
Can I just interrupt in order to try to get you to talk about something? And I didn't ask you ahead of time, so if you don't feel comfortable doing this, don't. But I think it's very interesting for the viewers that Chief Bobby Joe is your father. And so we're hearing his firsthand account of what happened to him and how that affected his life. And I wonder if in the remarks that you're making now, if you could talk about being his daughter and how that has affected you to help people understand what generational grief is and how it trickles.
No, you're asking a lot, but yes, I will answer that. And it's not just my father, it's my mother as well. So both my parents went to residential school. And it's one of the reasons why I speak about how do you expect a person to come out of an institution like that, when the only touch and the only words that they've heard for the majority of their life are in anger and in rage and in hatred. And then they come together trying to find love, is what Jess talked about, with all of those tracks that I talked about built in. So you're not being heard, you're not being listened to, it's nothing but anger comes out. And so for me, I often say I grew up in hell. You'll hear survivors talk about a time before. In trauma, there's a time before and a time after. In an intergenerational survivor's time, it starts in the beginning. and it carries on until something changes. And for lots of people that usually ends up in an early death. And or in lots of other harmful things happening. For me, my mother's family passed she had 14 brothers and sisters. And by the time I was 20 something, 10 of them were gone. Yeah, all of them early deaths, all of them pretty much violent. And so living in that kind of an environment, growing up in that kind of an environment, and not just with my parents, but just in that generation, right? In that generation, everybody learned the same thing. So it was very normal behavior. And so for me, learning to communicate in that style and knowing that life was unsafe and knowing that the only way I was going to be able to protect myself and my siblings, I was very much the mama bear. And so it's been a challenge in my own life, and it's taken a long time to work through it. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation about rage, because I know based on experience, you know, and we're seeing it. The first time I heard it, when somebody had put some paint on, had thrown paint on the front doors of one of the churches, that was the first time I heard about sort of the violence towards the church. And I thought, oh my God, once this gate opens, and the response was, and this was what was so infuriating to me, was instead of understanding why that person might have that kind of a response and trying to get them some help to sort through what was obviously like, what am I going to do? That helplessness. The police arrested that individual like instantaneously. And I just thought, oh my God, you really think that's going to help? You really think that that's the best step, the best next step you can take in this time in our history right now, and this time in our country's genesis? And so I really believe that we have to make better choices, not just us as Indigenous people, but newcomers need to really understand this history. It's why, you know, one of the very first values we have as Reconciliation Canada is understanding and openness. Openness would be one of the first ones, and it's to help with the understanding. You have to be open enough to be able to share what you're really thinking, like this question you've asked me now. And you have to be open enough to really listen and hear it from a different perspective. That's hard work, rather than judging. You have to suspend judgment, and you have to be open enough to listen to gain understanding. And why do you show up to the table this way with your thoughts and your beliefs and your values and your systems? You know, and the easiest way for people to understand it oftentimes, and it kind of lightens it a little bit, is everybody has a right way and has a right way for the toilet paper roll to go on. Every family has a rule around that, right? And yeah. Okay, have fun. And so we have to show up in those ways. We have to show up. Life is about relationships. And if you really want to develop a relationship together, because none of us are going away, right? We're all going to be here, and we need to learn how to behave with one another and treat one another with dignity. That doesn't matter what color you are, or what your religion is, or what your gender or your sexual orientation, or whatever you want to call it. And so I think those are really important conversations. And that's the hardest part about reconciliation. That's where the courage comes in, you know, to be able to speak what you really think, whether it's right or wrong, but also to be open to listening to why somebody else thinks differently than that, and really open your soul to that, and try to understand, you know, from a compassionate way. So rage is a tough one, and it's everywhere. It's everywhere, certainly in the generation that I came from. Because of that history, that's part of the intergenerational grief, never being heard. That's the only way people know to be heard. So that's where I'm at with it.
Mhm.
I really appreciate you sharing that out so openly, especially where I kind of blindsided you with that. But you know, your whole family has given so much to this, and I hope that people watching can you see how brave it is to share your personal and your family things for the good of all. So if they can be brave enough to do that, can you not be brave enough to take the step and not worry about making a mistake? Right? Because so many people don't want to get involved because what if I say the wrong thing? What if I do the wrong thing? I don't even want to type my question in because what if I use the wrong terminology and somebody jumps on me? Well, you have to accept that mistakes are part of life. In fact, I think it's where all the juice is in life. I think it's the best part. I love it when I win and when I do right. I very seldomly grow from that. I grow from when I make a mistake. I grow from when I fall down. And you know, if I can share a story with you, my oldest brother Billy was 21 when I was born, and he's a great athlete. And when I was 4, he could ski powder like you wouldn't believe, just a beautiful skier. When I was 4, he said, "I'm going to teach you how to ski, sweetheart." So I was all turned out. I had my little blue ski boots on and my bomber jacket, no front teeth, all ready for looking cute, all ready for my lesson. And Billy, who was a big bodybuilder, he came up to me and put his big paw on my chest and poof, he pushed me down in the snow. And I said, I thought you were going to teach me how to ski. And he said, "I'm going to teach you how to ski, baby. But first, I'm going to teach you how to get up because falling is inevitable when you're learning how to ski. But he said, if you know how to get up, you will ski without fear." Now, when I was 4, I thought he was talking about skiing. 24 years after cancer took him from me, I realized he was teaching me about life and that we can't fear our mistakes. So the only way that we are going to get going and get moving forward is if people give up this fear of making a mistake. You might get called racist. That's okay. Good, kind, caring, loving, positive people say and do racist things every day. It's the nature of the world that we live in. You have to just say, okay, there's something I didn't know, because you know what? You don't know what you don't know. Right. And then you've got to just like ask for forgiveness for that mistake, learn something from it, get up and move on to your next mistake. And once you string a whole bunch of those mistakes together, you might just wake up and find yourself an ally. So I just add that so that people don't get paralyzed in that fear. And if you can see how brave these panelists are in sharing their innermost feelings with you and sharing their tears with you, be brave enough to make a mistake. That's all I think we're asking. I just want to check and see other questions. We've got like 4 minutes left here. Lot of lovely acknowledgements for all the sharing that's happening. As a parent and educator, how can we help going forward? Where is a good place to start? Jeremy, did you want to jump in on that? You've been a bit quiet, or Jess, either of you, you've been a little quiet.
Yeah, for sure. I think, yeah, looking at educating and kind of navigating this part of history, it's a true part of our history. And I remember being really young, and when my father was in the Blackwater case, and my parents sat me down in like a very age appropriate way, said, this is a part of what's happening for your father. This is what's a part of what's happening for your family. And this is why. And they explained to me about the residential schools, and they explained to me about his experience in a really age appropriate way that wasn't creating vicarious trauma or creating like angst around it, but they did find a way to convey in a really beautiful, gentle way that these schools were not a healthy place for anybody, and that's part of what my father lived through. And so it's about, yeah, finding ways to convey these messages and these stories in a way that doesn't create vicarious trauma, or that doesn't create pain for other people, but still emphasizes that there was trauma that happened and there was hurt that happened. And, as we got older, or as I got older, the conversation changed to be more age appropriate and to be, to help me have an understanding of why my family and my father and even my biological mother were the way they were and are the way they are and continue to be. because there's so many of our folks who haven't found their healing and who, so yeah, it's about finding those ways of having conversations that are uncomfortable but safe. The main part of these conversations that I believe that I've been having since I was in elementary school, because back to my first point is, I remember sticking my hand up in like social studies and being like, what about this part of our history? And it made the teacher very uncomfortable, and it made the teacher like, I like just kind of sideswiped him, and he was like, oh, we don't talk about that in this part of social studies, like we do it in an older grade. And I was like, oh cool, what grade? Tell me. And yeah, so challenging in ways that are safe. I felt safe in that moment to kind of speak my truth and say, this is what I was going through, and I wasn't heard, in the 90s. So it's like, I think it caused rage in it. And so I wrote a letter to the newspaper being like, as a child of a survivor, this is what our family is going through. Because I need people to hear. And I think I did an okay job. My mom helped me. I was pretty young. But I've been having these conversations since I was a child, and yeah, it's exhausting, and there's a lot of emotions that come with it, and there's a lot of complexity that comes with these conversations, because I also recognize that as First Nations people, we don't have the hallmark on trauma that other folks in the world have lived through this. And I always try to hold space and honor that, and to say, this is what we went through, and this is how some of us are healing. This is what we offer to the world, our understanding as Wolmoth people, as people who belong to the land that we belong to, that have the responsibilities of the people that we come from. And so, this is a part of these conversations, and recognizing it's our choice. When we have rage, it's our choice for our actions. I remember, this will be quick, I promise. I remember I was looking at our traditional rock carvings in the Snuneymuxw territory, and they have heart-shaped heads, and I always curious and always asking questions that maybe I shouldn't be asking. So I was like, why we don't have heart-shaped heads? This is weird. Like, why, like, we don't look like this. Why would they do this? And my dad sat there for a while, and he goes, I remember being taught from my elders, because he asked the same question, why are they shaped like that? He says, it shows us and our people coming forward that we have that choice which way we go. We have that choice of how we react to anything. And it's that good or evil, that and it's finding that balance in between those peaks. And it's not easy. It takes very much a lot of healing to get into a place, because I think about my mom talking about my Coke bottle like just exploding. I was never taught or told to internalize my anger. I was never told, don't be angry, but I still found myself doing it because of the surroundings that I was being brought up in, even though both of my parents have done a lot of beautiful, beautiful healing and coming to terms with trauma and coming to terms with intergenerational trauma, that there were still family members outside of my immediate family where I just learned to internalize this rage. And it was in these conversations of, it's our choice how we walk forward. It's our choice how we have these conversations. And I'm not saying I'm perfect. I'm not saying that, I don't say hurtful things. I don't, I make mistakes, and, I've done hurtful things to people in the past, and I've tried to learn from them, and I try to continue on in my life and grow from whatever experiences. And so that's my 2 cents.
Thank you for that, Jeremy. And for viewers, just so you know, Yvonne is Jeremy's mother. So that it's a family affair this afternoon. And with that, we are at the end of our time, and we have a song that's going to wrap up the day for us. But I want to first thank Yvonne and Jess and Chief Bobby Joe and Jeremy and Karen for sharing so generously and so openly, and having this very difficult but very poignant conversation. And although I thought it was going to be Willie closing, something tells me that I can see Baby with her skull cap and her drum, and that gives me the signal that perhaps it's going to be Shelley that's singing us out. Is that correct, Shelley?
That's what I understand.
Wonderful.
Ela Kesla, Nugwadi, Hekwagila Ogwa. I am Hekwagila Ogwa. My English name is Shelley Joseph. I'm the baby of Chief Robert Joseph, Karen's little sister. Like Candy, my whole family calls me Babe still. I'm 51 and I'm still Babe. And I love it. It's a term of endearment. And I think of all those children who didn't have that in their lives. But I've been fortunate to have the leadership that my father and my mother have examples of healing. And I've been doing the same on my own journey for my own children. I gave birth to 3, but I have about 12 kids who call me mom. And from that, I have 4 beautiful grandchildren. One that you heard, he's with Karen. He spends a lot of time with her. He really loves her, and just so grateful for the connection that we have as family. And speaking of anger and grief and healing and how and all of that, I learned, when I learned what my parents had gone through, what they experienced, I understood why they were, and that changed my purview. It changed how I felt, just with that understanding. You know, to truly listen to what they had experienced changed everything for me. I currently have my own business, Ladders to Kindness training, and I talk about the power of listening, active listening without the filters, without responding, without fixing, and how far that act of kindness and all little acts of kindness can go. But we need to be intentional, and we need to be sitting in our values. I think that's what's really lost when anger is acted upon. Yeah, be angry, but don't act from that anger. Don't treat people from that anger. Feel the anger and release it in the ways that people have shared today. Go to the water, sing, run, clean the kitchen, all those ways. Let it out there, but not on other people. Because in our culture, in my language, we have a word, namwit. It means we are all one. What we do to one, we do to everybody. What we do to ourselves, we do to everybody. And imagine if we were all coming and treating each other as though we love one another. I love you. I don't know you. I may never meet you, but I love you. And I think that's what's going to change the world. That's what's going to help us heal and move forward. Love, love, and more love. The song I want to sing for you today was composed by the late Chief Frank Nelson. He was an Indian residential school survivor himself and had I always say the audacity to grow and heal, because they wanted to destroy who we were as people. And all of our survivors had the audacity to not be destroyed, to get up, stand there, share their stories over and over again in the hopes that we could create a better world together. And so to honor him, who made this song and gave it to my father, Robert Joseph Quin Kuligidzi Wakes, another survivor, who since handed it to my firstborn. She's an intergenerational, a second generation survivor. And the connection that we all have with this hope for love and healing and growing together, to honor all the generations, and especially those children that were found in those rediscovered graves. I want to sing this song. It speaks about our first ancestor, the Thunderbird. And while I sing it, I encourage all of you to invite your ancestors to always guide you in good ways and how we are together in this world. Gaila Kessler. Oh, hi, hey, 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 oh, hi, oh, hey, oh, hi, hey, 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 oh, hi, oh, O kania imas kasoa heya heya o kania imas kasoa heya o kania aquentis talagilis casoa ahea o haya hey hey o haya hoa hea oh, hiya, hey, 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 oh, hiya, hoa, hey, hey, oh. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Remember, be bold with your love, love harder, love boldly everywhere you go. Gaelic has
Thank, thank you so much, Shelley. That was an absolutely beautiful song. I want to thank all of you who tuned in. I would encourage you, let's try to really grow this viewing audience. Maybe as an act of reconciliation, you could share that this is happening every Saturday and every Tuesday night for the next 7 weeks now. And maybe you could share this with 3 or 4 of your friends and encourage them to join you and join us on Tuesday night. I want to give the panelists another big shout out. I think today's conversation was incredibly personal, and it certainly helped me personally as we started this session. My sister's funeral started at home. My sister Penny passed away a week ago, and I couldn't be there because of COVID restrictions, but it really did my heart good to be with the greater human family. So thank you for spending this time with us, and please share it with people. Meet us here again on Tuesday night. My name is Candy Palmater. I'm happy to moderate these on behalf of Reconciliation Canada. You can find me on social media at The Candy Show. Remember, love yourselves and love one another. Bye-bye.